Okay, well, good morning, everybody. I want to welcome you to ITIF event on a scintillating topic in December on how government productivity can be improved by innovation and technology. It's funny, I was at a meeting a while back and I talked about the importance of productivity, and somebody said, well, productivity, that's just all about paying workers less, isn't it? Or moving work to China. So just a clarification of what actually productivity is. Productivity is simply, at least labor productivity, it's the amount of output per worker per hour of work. It's really all it is. And this is the central driver of prosperity. That's the reason we're one of the richest countries in the world, is because we've been able to put in place technology and other kinds of systems that allow workers to produce more. And that's also going to play an important role in dealing with the overall government budget deficit. Unfortunately, we have absolutely no clue whether government productivity is going up or going down or what the heck is going on. We have no clue. And that's because in our infinite wisdom in 1994, Congress cut the funding for the Bureau of Labor Statistics for state and local government productivity series. And in 1996, they cut the funding for the federal government productivity series. And so the only series they do collect today is the U.S. Postal Service, which actually has had a relatively good productivity growth in the last decade, partly through technology. But when we go back and look at some of the numbers from 67 to 94, which is sort of the only series you have available, you find really wide divergence of things. Personnel management had no improvement in productivity. So you look at all the OPM-like functions in the federal government, no improvement in productivity. Government support services had an annual rate of 2.2%, which was better than the overall economy. Finance and accounting had an overall productivity growth rate of 2/3 better than the overall economy. So what we know about this then is that this is an important topic, that new technology today can play an important role in that. And my sense is that we're not doing anywhere near enough of what we should be doing. So this is really the focus of the panel today. And we have a really stellar panel to talk about this today, starting on my immediate left, Daniel Castro, who's a senior analyst at ITIF focusing on IT policy. Daniel used to be, before coming to ITIF, was at the Government Accountability Office, where he was an IT analyst. There's a long experience in looking at how government's using IT. And he has a computer science degree from Carnegie Mellon University. Tom Dorman is the director of public sector practice at McKinsey & Company. He's also the co-founder of McKinsey's public sector practice. He directs the work with tax authorities and public finance agencies, as well as McKinsey's research on public sector productivity. If you have not seen it, there's an excellent report back there that McKinsey did recently that Tom led on how government can improve productivity, including through technology. Tom joined McKinsey in 1996 and has a BA from Macalester College and an MPA. Marcus Peacock is a visiting scholar at George Washington University in the Regulatory Studies Center. Prior to this, he was the Minority Staff Director in the U.S. Senate Budget Committee, and he was also former Deputy Administrator of the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Including, during that tenure, he overhauled the EPA's performance management system and a number of other things. So he has a really strong understanding of GIPRA and the strengths and weaknesses and the role that plays in government productivity. He has a master's degree in public policy from Harvard Kennedy School of Government and a bachelor's degree in industrial and systems engineering. Stan Ratcliffe is president of NCR Government Systems, which is a part of NCR Corporation. For those of you who go to your banks and use an ATM machine, that's oftentimes NCR technology, or you go to the grocery store and you use self-checkout. Stan is focused on driving the adoption of next-generation self-service solutions that facilitate the exchange of information among governments and their constituents. Most recently, he was Vice President of Defense Agencies for Hewlett-Packard. He's also been Associate Commissioner for Business Process Reengineering and Transition Development at the IRS. He also holds a bachelor's degree in industrial engineering and operations research. And finally, Alan Shark. Alan is executive director of the Public Technology Institute. For those of you who don't know, PTI is a really interesting group that's been around probably, 30 years, 40 years. And it really focuses on helping state, local, county governments better utilize technology to improve their performance. Alan's career spanned over 30 years as a leader in nonprofit management and technology fields. He's also an associate professor at Rutgers University, where he teaches a master's level course on technology and public administration. Recipient of a number of awards, including the National Technology Champion Award from the National Association of State CIOs, and a number of books, including 7 Trends That Will Transform Local Government Through Technology. So with that, each panelist will make maybe about 10 minutes of comments, and we should have plenty of time for discussion, and we will adjourn precisely at 10:30.
Great. Thanks, Rob, and thanks, everyone, for coming out today. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about 2 areas where I see real opportunities for government to leverage technology. I'm kind of a technologist at heart, so when I look at the government, I just I think you see a difference between what the private sector is doing and what government's doing, and you can see very important technology trends right now that show where government could move. So the first one is self-service, as Rob mentioned. We did a big study on self-service technology a while back, looking at where the opportunities are both in the private sector and in the public sector. And self-service is really about using technology to create new opportunities for the end user to take on a role that used to be delivered by a service worker. So it's everything from, when you rode up the elevator today, you push the button instead of having somebody there doing it for you, to, the ATMs, all the kiosks at the airports, self-pay parking. When you start to pay attention, you really see how much change we've seen over the last 10 years. And there's really 4 areas of technology where we see this change happening. We have, again, the kiosk, where NCR has just, pretty much changed the way we interact with so many different services. We also have online, mobile, especially with mobile apps, and then telephone, especially with the interactive voice response systems. And what we see is there's a lot of kind of end user benefits. So it's more convenient. You can usually do these things 24/7. You don't have to worry about a person. The end user also has a lot more control, so they can set their own pace. They can have more privacy in what they're doing. They can interact in the language of their preference, these kinds of things. But more than that, there's a lot of these productivity benefits that we're talking about here. So, whether it's an agency or a business, it's about changing not just back office productivity, but you have front office productivity now. So just as a lot of organizations thought very hard about how they could use IT to make their workers more productive, now they're thinking about how to make their customers or their citizens who are interacting with their services more productive as well. And these changes really lead to very significant cost savings. So, here's some examples. For example, at a bank, if you do an online transaction, the unit cost is 20 cents versus $4.25 if you go into a branch. At airports, it's $3 to check in with an agent versus under 15 cents using a kiosk. So we see this in government as well. So, for example, a government agency, if they were using a person to enroll a new worker when they're hiring, doing all the HR paperwork, that's around $30 versus $5 if they automate the process. At tax returns, the IRS saves $2.15 for every return that's filed online versus the ones that are filed on paper. And any agency that has customer service, if they're having phone calls, they're paying about $7.50 per call versus 32 cents if you're doing an automated phone system. So there's these really kind of large opportunities here, really at any point where there's a touch point between government and citizens. And when we look at this area, we see there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. So, for example, DMVs, right? That's an area everyone hates to do this. You would think that's an opportunity to really see a lot of change. And we have seen some movement here, but we've also seen resistance. So I think one, and we can talk about this a little bit more in the discussion of why we don't have more of these technologies. In Massachusetts, they implemented a policy so that if you went into a DMV, you would pay $5 extra versus you did it online or you did it by phone or by mail. And there was this big backlash. Why are you penalizing people who want to use an in-person service? And that's kind of a problematic policy when you want to incentivize these types of services. The other area that I want to talk about is data-driven innovation. Big data, open data, we see a lot of movement towards using data for novel purposes. And there's a lot of opportunities here for government to do the same, to use data to make better decisions. The trend right now is especially in using data for data analytics, and we see many different areas for government improvement. So one is just pure operational performance. So this is about gaining more insight into what an organization is doing, to have managers have real oversight, for the leaders of an organization to be able to see, oh, you know what, emergency responders, there's delays, and we need to figure out what's causing that. Or there's some variability in the past few months, or this team is performing worse than this team, and maybe we can correct it. There's also opportunities to use things like satisfaction levels and use novel data sources. So now, before if you want to know, is your agency doing well, you might have to go out and do an extensive survey. Now you can use maybe social media and collect similar types of data and get real-time feedback on what's working and what's not working. We've seen interesting data being applied to things like crime mapping, so that you can identify hotspots of criminal activity and adjust policing in response to that. We also see personalization as another way to use data. And this happens in government in many ways, especially when you're talking about delivering unique services to specific populations. So you see this a lot in opportunities in healthcare and social services. If you have a particular intervention you're looking to do, for example, if you want to target outcomes for mothers on Medicaid, you can very precisely target certain groups, and you can use even more data than before to really dig in and deliver services in a very personalized way. The two other areas I want to mention, one is fraud detection. This is, of course, something that every agency looks at. I was at the GAO, so I saw it from that perspective, but we have inspector generals basically in every federal agency, and at the state and local we have a lot of oversight as well. There are many opportunities where data analytics really makes this work so much better. So, for example, the Postal Service, they get a lot of worker compensation claims because of the nature of the work. How do they decide which ones are the ones that are likely fraudulent and which ones they should be spending their time looking at? It turns out they use data analytics that they've already started applying. They can use their resources so much better and actually find the ones that are problematic and process the other claims much faster. But we see this at everywhere else. IRS doing this on tax returns. And basically, any agency, SEC, HUD, Social Security Administration, any agency that's using forms, that's collecting data from people that they need to process these forms, they need to figure out which ones are correct and can speedily go through the process, or which ones need more oversight. They can pay attention to that, and you can automate that and improve that. And it really also helps make sure you are using your workers to the best ability. So you don't have workers that are checking to make sure a form is completed, which is very low value work, and instead they're doing high value work. So they're helping someone with a tax preparation question. And that's the kind of shift that we want to see in government and workers. So the last area I wanted to mention is just smart infrastructure. This is something that I think, because of the nature of government work, we don't always think about this, but of course governments have a lot of buildings that they're responsible. There's a lot of advances in smart building infrastructure and building automation that we can talk about. Even if it's just optimizing heating and cooling in the building, you're downstream, you're reducing downtime for the people in those buildings. You're improving the maintenance, so you're spending less time on maintenance workers. You have smart fleets, so any agency that has vehicles, trucks, buses, city fleets, using data analytics, you can identify when you're likely to have failures and reduce those downtimes. And even if you're talking about transportation, so smart bridges, highways, roads, parking, using sensors, we can collect much more data and really make these improve, so you can spend less time sending engineers out on the road just to look for problems and actually spending more time fixing problems. So again, I think the main takeaway, as Rob said, we don't have the real granular data to be able to say this is what productivity is versus what it isn't. But we can, when we're looking at the technology, see some really interesting differences between how the private sector is moving forward very quickly in areas and where the government's lagging. So,
great. Thank you. Don?
Okay.
There you go. Can you move that closer?
Yeah. There we go. Thank you, Rob and ITF, for giving me the opportunity to join you all this morning. I have to say, this is an exciting topic. So obviously, over the last month or two, we've seen where there's been technology failures and perhaps particularly in healthcare.gov, around a failure to deliver certainly to the aspirations, and for many of us to match the experience that we live in our day-to-day lives. That said, I actually think that we're at the cusp of driving quite significant change in government. If you go back in time, on the civilian side, the government was actually an early adopter of technology, and in particular the federal government. It had the scale and the resources to do things. So Daniel mentioned a lot of things. If you go all the way back to the 1960s, the IRS developed essentially the first database in the world that was used for transactional processing. Obviously, the government on the sort of defense and security side continues to be an innovator and user of technology, but that early adoption, which really the government was a pioneer and then later adopted in the private sector, obviously the government, I think, in many ways has become a laggard. It's utilized in probably more at the state and local government for interesting things like DMV, etc. But when you look at it, by all estimates, the opportunity adds up to billions and billions of dollars of economic value. Not necessarily cost savings, but economic value. Several years ago, I led some research. We estimated that it was conservatively $100 billion. That was 8 or 9 years ago. More recent research that we've led says if you're able to harness one component of it globally for governments related to data, which is really just getting the value out of new technologies, that could be upwards of $3 trillion globally across governments. So if you take the U.S. share of that, that's at least a few $100 billion between the federal and state and local. When we look at these trends, the reason that I get excited are a few things. First and foremost, the costs are coming down quite significantly for technology adoption. The second is there's the commercialization of it. So 10 years ago, everyone was uniquely building their own products or their own data analytics largely. It is now becoming ubiquitous. The cost of computing power is plummeting. And it's truly, we're getting closer, it's not fully there, but closer that anyone can harness and use this pretty creatively. If you look at the new tech startups, a simple one like Snapchat, they actually have no IT department. They can buy all of this modularly, they can get their cloud services, they can get technology, etc. And they're about how do you use the data, how do you construct it. That's going to make it a lot easier for the government. We know sitting in Washington, and you can speak to government leaders, and it's even more exacerbated at state and local governments, it's really hard to get technology talent. We're not competitive with the private sector, et cetera, et cetera. We get mission-oriented people who are willing to do it because they believe in the purpose. But essentially, the war for talent, you're not winning. So this commercialization is going to make it much easier for government to do it. And when I look at some of the specific technology aspects, things like the mobile internet, the Internet of Things or sensors, and Daniel talked about smart infrastructure, cloud computing, these are things that play right into fundamentally delivery of the government's mission. And perhaps even a dramatic improvement in how it does it, or an expansion of ways in which it can engage and help and work with citizens. The one aspect that I think is particularly important, and I'll just highlight on it, is big data technologies and really using this data. So the way I think about the opportunity, and the government's just on the cusp of it on the civilian side, is how do you harness the data within your agency and perhaps across government to fundamentally make better decisions and improve and sort of better data-driven evidence work. The next frontier beyond that is this expansion and impact with society, which is unleashing some of the data the government has. So let me explore a couple of those items. When you think about harnessing the data and using it for better decision making, there's many concepts. So Daniel mentioned improper payments, fraud across government. Today, every agency does it on its own. whether it does it or doesn't do it, I should say. Many of them don't even have data that's in a format in which they can identify patterns of fraud or simply abuse. A simple one, because you mentioned the Postal Service, a case last year of tax fraud was actually detected not by the Postal Service's technology. It was detected by a letter carrier who said, it's a little interesting that I just delivered 2,504 tax refund checks to the same address. So you could say, how could we do this differently? There's any number of places along there, but you could imagine if you go one step before that in the Postal Service, they don't actually analyze the data that goes to addresses, even though it's all collected electronically. And there's privacy issues to all of this, so I just want to caveat it, but it's an interesting one. You go much further up to where within the IRS, the algorithms simply don't look at mailing addresses. That's not in the algorithm because that's in a different database that doesn't link up to the algorithm. So if you think about how do you digitize and make available the data, it's quite apparent that there's a unbelievable wealth of information that sits within agencies and across the government to allow for better decision making. A simple one where you start to look at fraud going overseas is the Kenyan government launched an open data portal, something similar to usaspending.gov, and simply putting the data out there so other agencies could use it, in this case also the public could use it. People quickly help them identify fraudulent contractors or others. Their own estimate is it saved them $1 billion simply by making the data available within government. When you get more interesting, that's kind of the nuts and bolts, and in many ways that's the federal government playing catch-up and state and local government playing catch-up to what businesses do. Certainly health insurers and others try to link all of their data to identify fraud and or target better applications. I think it gets more interesting when you think about how do you then engage and empower the citizens. So the example of Kenya was both internal government as well as starting to engage and empower citizens. A simple one, and many of us now benefit from it, is the sort of digital 311 systems where you can snap a photo and it's GPS tagged of here's a pothole, could you please fix it on my streets? Several state and local governments are starting to just harness that data, and because they can put it into algorithms, they can also be more efficient where they send their road crews and other types of things. And that's where citizens start to help government and get better services because hopefully the government's more efficient to do it. You can go one step further and actually redefine the relationship between the public, private, and social sectors. And this is where particularly unleashing some of the data allows innovations to happen, particularly by the private sector. So things like the development of health indices and which hospitals are better, and we've seen it for a long time. Dartmouth has done research to try to help governments, but now we're starting to change it so that citizens can actually select, hey, this is a better hospital for me to get a hip or knee replacement. It has better health outcomes, lower infection rates, etc. And that's the type of information that the government collected by opening it up. We've now actually enabled the private sector to analyze it and package it and provide better service to citizens. By the way, the government could do that themselves, but this is just how it evolves because I think when you release it and have it there, you can unlock innovation, and you see that more broadly in society where the value of open data, even within the private sector, can drive innovations. A different one to sort of help us frame why there may be benefits to government having it open is if you look at Google Maps, they made that completely open source, and it's enabled a whole range of businesses like Airbnb, Uber, UberX, if you've used these technologies, and they figured out that their value is they could commercialize others using their data, which is interesting if you think about it. And then finally, I think some of the data and opening it up, the value is that we can start to engage and invest in the talent within government to move from more rote tasks to higher value tasks. And fundamentally, that's where the interesting part of government comes. It's not from actually doing accounts payable or other types of things, but how do we actually fulfill the missions and change our kind of human capital investments towards harnessing and leveraging this technology. Obviously, in this drive towards innovation, we see the risks. We see it around privacy, security, and I would venture to say that we're all going to have many more bumps along the road as we move forward. But I think if we imagine a place 10 years from now, I think we're really moving up the S-curve of innovation for government. And we've just seen the early things with web adoption, but the next 10 years, I think, no matter what's happening in Congress, what the budget deals are, we can thank state and local governments for pushing forward on innovation, particularly cities. But you will see this adopted, I'm sure, at the federal level, and I think in governments around the world.
Great, thank you, Tom. Marcus? Yeah, press it.
I felt that. Thank you, Robert. I wanted to thank ITIF for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm actually a bit of an oddball for this panel. It's the only, I think, IT or data system I've installed was the Wi-Fi system in my house. I've never designed or installed or executed or tried to sell anything in this world of IT. I'm kind of more or less a federal budget geek. And looking particularly at the bios of the other panelists reminded me of a church service I went to a couple Sundays ago that a friend took me to at his church. And at the early part of the service, the pastor invited all the kids in the congregation to come forward. And it took a while, of course, the kids come out of the pews and up to the front. But by the time they were up there, the pastor looked at them and said, so what's the first thing you think of when I say the word frog? And without any hesitation, this little boy right up the front, he blurts out, God! God. And the pastor turns to him and he says, why does the word frog remind you of God? And the boy said, well, you wouldn't have us come all the way down here just to talk about frogs. So I don't think you'd have me come all the way down here just to talk about the federal budget. But as the program alludes to, what's going on with the federal budget does have an impact on what's happening with IT, and particularly with efforts to improve productivity in the federal government and federal programs. So I'm going to make 3 points. And if you're taking notes, particularly with pen, you want to hold off for just a second. But my 3 points are that, first of all, the tight discretionary budget is the enemy of productivity. It's hurting productivity. That's my first point. The second point is a tight discretionary budget is irrelevant to federal productivity. It's irrelevant. And the third is, you might guess this, that a tight discretionary budget is the friend of productivity. In fact, I think it's going to be necessary for productivity gains. Now, those 3 things, of course, contradict each other. So how can I make them all work? Well, I can differentiate them, but I first of all wanted to make sure that everybody sort of understood what I mean by discretionary budget. It's a term of art, and some people know what it means, others don't. Anybody know what the discretionary budget or discretionary spending is?
Yeah, it's the half that does not constitute entitlements, right?
Yes, the half that doesn't constitute entitlement. So there's entitlement spending. Some people call it mandatory spending. And that is essentially, some people say this is spending on autopilot. If you qualify for Medicaid or farm benefits, you can just walk into a federal office and show them that you qualify, and you're entitled to the services or the money that are offered. But there's a part of the budget, the discretionary part of the budget, which has to go through an appropriations process every year. That's why people don't necessarily consider this on autopilot. There has to be congressional action every year to appropriate this money. And you mentioned this is half. It's actually not anymore. discretionary appropriations used to be most of the federal budget. It is now about less than 40% of the federal budget and getting smaller. It's about $1 trillion. And this is the money that agencies tend to use to operate every year. That's where a lot of that money comes from. Some of it's in grants, but in terms of payroll and operations, and particularly a lot of the contracts, this comes from discretionary spending. And the recent agreement in the House, which was voted on the House and to be voted on the Senate, would put discretionary spending for this year at about $1 trillion. And entitlement spending is right now over $2 trillion and heading up to $3 trillion in about 5 years. So what's happened is that discretionary spending has been tightened. It went up every year for decades, and more recently it's actually flattened out, down a little, and is generally flattened out. Now, the first point I made was discretionary spending is an enemy to productivity, which seems to be contrary to the very notion of this panel. If you read the first sentence, I think, in the description of today's topic, it's that these tight budgets are forcing federal managers to look for productivity. Now, I'm going to assert that in the short term, I'm going to differentiate, now you can take notes, differentiate these 3 points by short term, midterm, and long term. In the short term, that means this year, probably next year, 1 or 2 years from now, these tight discretionary budgets are actually hurting innovation. And there's a couple simple reasons for that. And one is, despite what Tom said, many of these innovative proposals have costs that are up front, and they're getting lower, but they do have costs up front. And so in an atmosphere where a federal manager has a tight budget this year, and you're asking them to spend a little more to get gains later on, the response is often, I can't afford to do that this year. I'm very interested in it, maybe next year, but I can't afford to do it this year. They can't afford to spend money right now to save money later on. Which connects with the second reason, is most federal managers, not all of them, but most federal managers have not yet accepted the fact that they are going to have flat declining budgets for the foreseeable future. We all know that. We've seen the CBO and GAO projections, which show this great difference in increasing deficits, which explode after the next few years. But until federal managers actually accept this and they see it, they are not going to be trying hard to change things drastically. When I was at EPA, for 4 years I think we proposed rather modest budgets for the 4 years I was there through 2008. And we would have a big budget meeting, and I'd say, well, we all know we're in a fiscal crisis, and we can't expect a lot of money this next year or in the foreseeable future. And everybody would nod and look concerned, and yes, we accept this. And the year after I left, fiscal year 2009, EPA's budget went from about $7.5 billion, which it had been for a while, to almost $15 billion. It almost doubled into fiscal year 2009. Now, it's come down since then. But when federal managers hear this over and over, but they're used to decades of increases, and then after you've said it, all of a sudden they get double the next year, they're not going to believe it until it actually happens. They're not going to. So, now some I think have. You go into the Department of Defense, and some people are facing it right now. But for the vast majority of federal managers, this has not become a reality. So in the short term, these tight discretionary budgets, I think, are something that are hurting the acceptance of innovation, which result in greater productivity. So that's like this year, next year, maybe 3 years. But in the midterm, so that's 3, 4, 5 years, I think it's going to be largely irrelevant. As this begins to evolve and federal managers begin to face a continuing flat budget, perhaps even decreasing budget, there's going to be a period where they muddle through, and some of them are already doing this. They're going to be slicing salami, as they say. They're going to be looking for the low-hanging fruit. The subscription list will get scrubbed. There'll be attrition of GS-15s that may not get replaced or get replaced with GS-9s or 11s. And they're going to kind of muddle through this period. And really what's going to come to the fore, what's going to motivate them the most, is something that motivates them a lot today. And that has to do with fear. And I've heard someone describe this, I forget who it was, so I can give it credit for it. They said the number one objective of most political appointees is to get on the front page of the Washington Post. They've got an agenda that they want to put before people, they want to get attention for it, and they want to get coverage for it. And so there's a constant battle to try and get your particular project or mission out into the front page. The number one goal, this person claimed, of a senior civil service federal manager is to stay off the front page of the Washington Post. Because usually that means you're in trouble. And you don't necessarily have to do something wrong. It's, particularly in this politically charged atmosphere, you just have to do something that's perceived by somebody as doing something wrong. I mean, nobody wants to be the next lowest learner, right? That is death. So, and the way you can get there is through change. The way you avoid risk and being on the front page of the Washington Post is avoiding changing the status quo. Anytime you're going to be changing something, you put yourself at risk. Now, that's not to say all federal managers feel that way, and they're absolutely not interested in changing the status quo, but it does put a rather high hurdle, particularly on the most innovative change, which puts them at risk. And particularly during this muddle-through time, I think that motivation is going to be much stronger than the budget squeeze that they may be facing as they attempt to muddle through. Now, there's the last stage, and my third point, which is in the long term. So that's maybe 4, but certainly 5, 6 years from now. Yes, there'll be an acceptance, there'll be a tipping point. Enough people and federal managers will understand that flat, perhaps in real terms, declining budgets are here to stay, and I absolutely have to figure out a way to deliver results at less cost. Or even, the best federal managers deliver more results at less cost. Now, this is a world, frankly, and Al will probably talk about this, that state and local officials already live in. Many of them face balanced budget requirements and the ups and downs of revenues, but this is not something federal managers have faced. But the sort of innovation that you have seen go on in state and local governments, you'll start seeing in the federal government, and there will be a transformation. And these proposals, which can transform how the government works, I think will be much more readily accepted across federal agencies. Now, some programs and bureaus and agencies may already be further along in this evolution I've described. But I don't think we're going to hit this tipping point and see a real change across the board for a number of years. And that may be somewhat depressing to some folks. But it does mean that there's value in working now and determining what these changes can be and putting these proposals forward and particularly targeting them to those programs or bureaus or agencies or offices that we think are further along in the evolution that's taking place here. And so from a Budget Geeks perspective, that's what I can offer. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Marcus. Stan.
Okay. There we go. Okay. So, first of all, thank you, Robert and ITF. From an NCR perspective, right now, we really live for government and the world really in a very innovative time. The whole world is being recreated. Not just productivity, but the world itself is being recreated every day. And it's happening all around you, whether it's banking, retail, shopping, transportation. Everything is dynamic and on the fly. And how technology impacts your life is both at home and work is driving not only businesses but the government. The government is a little more resistant to that change, but your whole lifestyle has changed. The analogy that I use, mine is my kids bought me all this stuff. I've got the TV, I've got the VCR, I got the Dolby receiver and everything else, and I had like 12 controllers. And even though I'm versed in technology, it was no fun to watch TV because I couldn't figure out which one to do. So I paid a guy who came in, he sat down on my floor, charged me $200, put it all in one controller. It worked great. Nobody thought of the dog putting his butt on the controller and hitting the key and locking the whole thing up. So 5 days without TV until I could get the guy to come back and sit in my living room for an hour. So there's technology and then there's technology, but what was it all about? It was about improving my consumer experience, or in this case for the government, the citizens' experience of interacting with the government. So if you take a look at everything that's happened recently, and besides the politics behind the nature of the Affordable Care Act, the consumer experience was horrendous in going to the website. And it prompted lots of different things. If you go and use pretty much any government service, The consumer experience drives the public backlash and then drives the subsequent reaction in legislation. And the government hasn't adapted yet to that consumer or citizen's experience about that's where it's at. You can look for a productivity gain, but if the citizen experience is good, the amount of funding to make the change exists. If the consumer experience is bad, then it's all about cost cuttings, inefficiency, and everything else. And it's a dawning of an age to try to make that citizen or consumer experience the right one. When you have the right one, you can drive productivity, you can prove efficiencies, and you will get money. And we're seeing it left and right in our activities with the government. When you can prove it, when you can run the trial, there are funds available, even in today's environment. When you're struggling, experience is bad, unfortunately you cut and create a self-fulfilling death spiral right now in several of the agencies. We know that for a reason. If you take a look at NCR, we're a 130 plus year company. We started with a premise that you needed a receipt. That's what our company was invented on. We then did cash registers. Nobody does that anymore. So if you've looked, we've gone from retail, like you said, travel experience, we're all there, but the whole back end, and we're a constant retransformation or re-engineering our company around the individual experience. It does tie to mega data and the big data and everything else, but you only get that data when you can achieve it through a good customer experience. And that's really what, when we talk about the government and driving productivity, it's about getting that experience there. Now, the potential in the government is huge, and self-service technology alone has been estimated to bring $130 billion in annual GDP to the economy if it was properly used. Now, it's about $1,100 a household in incremental business and income by using self-service, and a tremendous amount of productivity gains inside the government, estimated in the hundreds of billions of dollars a year. The more that you can get people and that citizen experience to engage with the government, the more the citizens want to take control of their interaction with the government. Most of you will interface today, and it's a very pre-described interface. You follow their rules, right? So we're a big advocate of e-government. The president has mandated that, and so that this journey begins with the quality of the interaction, right? That quality drives down not only the cost of rework, but it also drives down the cost of delivery. It boosts the efficiency, not only of the government worker, but of the individual interfacing into the government. And there's a whole productivity indice that when you're on the government side, as I was in the IRS looking out, you worry about it. The bigger productivity indice that you heard about today is how I lose productivity as an individual, or how does my business lose productivity interfacing with the government, right? So that's a whole area of savings that is not lost and needs to be measured from that standpoint. You certainly want growth and personalization. I mean, where we're at today is you want more people to interface with the government. Some people want more people to depend on the government, but it has to be personalized. When you interface, it has to be around what I need, not necessarily what you want me to need. And the transparency of that interaction. The other thing is, or the other key element is reaching the marginalized section of our society. We're working on technologies today to improve the user experience, but make the user experience accessible to the homeless. So, for example, we're working on a very large program. We're thinking it through with the Veterans Administration. There's over 7 million homeless veterans who have benefits but cannot get access to them, right? So the process that we have is by moving self-service technologies out, working cooperation with industry, you can put access points with the necessary security in public areas. Could be a post office, could be a public library, could be a Walmart, could be a Home Depot. But when you put that in there, the homeless have access to it. When they have access, they can make VA appointments, right? Some of the technology we have the ability for them to complete transactions around their medical records, even to the point where you can do electronic payments by dispensing to them a Visa check card. for a homeless person. So you're getting proof, you can do the biometrics, and you assure that people get benefits. And it's a whole different way to think about the consumer experience, right? And we spent a lot of time with VA, with our ergonomics group, to think through that experience. And we actually did that by going out, and I did it myself. We were at conventions, we were down and sat with the homeless and said, here's what they have in mind. And they would say, that doesn't do me any good. I'm homeless. You know, why put a scanner on a kiosk and expect I have my medical records? My whole life's in my shopping cart. I don't have paper. I cannot engage in a traditional manager. So you have to think outside the box. You have to think forward with that. And that whole consumer and citizen experience, and if somebody's interested, we have examples of that, of what we're doing in Denmark and Portugal and Ireland. And the outside the United States, there's a tremendous reduction in barriers to using information and technology and accessibility to serve constituents and citizens. And the amount of productivity improvements in those governments is huge. And I think to your point about entitlements and others, we're moving toward, our budgets are looking more and more like those entities and countries with a heavy degree of fixed cost around entitlements. And there has to be thinking about how do you move those entitlements and support that constituent base, right, in a manner that makes much more economic sense. So what can the government learn from the private sector? Number one, reinvent itself. Think differently. Don't be afraid to change process. To your point, one of the key areas is the upfront cost. Doesn't exist today. But it might be good to have a panel on what are the different ways that you finance that. Because today, most of my discussion is not around, we finally get it. How do we adjust the financials? How does this not become a traditional RFP with a upfront cost? How does it become a turnkey service offering, right? How does it become something that becomes out of the O&M side rather than the capital side of the budget? And I can put it in operational money, and I can then in turn size it accordingly. And I have proof points against a good customer experience and volume, I can get money. But without customer experience and without volume points to mining the big data, I can't get there within the budget. So there are ways to do it, which I know firsthand, because if you like it, how many people here use e-filing to do their taxes? Do you like it? You don't like e-filing? Damn, you're a funny person. When I was with IRS, we did e-filing. That was one of my pet peeves, was to modernize IRS and have a way to do it other than sending paperwork.
I'm a paper person. We've lost the paper trail. We've encouraged online fraud online. I like papers.
Okay, well, and you can still do that, right? So that's a good thing. The use of technology and productivity is huge. Again, it goes back to the creativity, and it exists and it can be safe. So a lot of what for productivity is a reapplication of existing technologies today to apply to the government. I struggle inside my company, which is very commercially oriented. When you think about it, ATMs, point of sale, we're 70-80% of the worldwide market share. We've had tremendous amount of success taking our technologies. I have to fight inside the company and just looking at it differently with the government. So it's sort of in my company to make a change and the government to look at commercial application process of product and say, what do I need to change to use a lower cost offering with high productivity points, right? As opposed to saying, I really need it this way. And TSA has been a big area that we've been working with in that regard. One of the things that you'll see as you go more and more to TSA are more handheld applications. What's the theory behind that? The theory is you stand in line, right? So we've worked with them today, and that agent that we used to do about 12 people, every 5 minutes, where you stand in line, maybe 20 if they're really good. We're putting technology in their hands today that where you can run through one person every 10 seconds. Totally checked. Matched against master databases, improve security and everything else. So it's an element of using technology. What we're also pushing is in the consumer experience and productivity is the world is moving to starting a transaction in one form, paper, but maybe completing it on a mobile app, right? So the technology at the touch point has to be able to look at a transaction, right? And in our company, we call it omni-channel. Whether you're going to a store or any place else, very, very seldom today do you start and end a transaction in the same medium, right? So your systems and your back end have to be able to support starting on your internet, ordering your Regal ticket, printing out a piece of paper, forgetting it, going back online when you get to the movie theater, and presenting it on a mobile device. That's my wife's Saturday night, right? right? But you have to have that flexibility, right? Or you have your wife and kids all screaming that, what did you do with the tickets, right? But that is the future, right? That is where we're going. The government has to adapt. There's a huge amount of productivity flow in that concept as well. I'm cognizant of time here. So mobile is huge, and the ability to adapt around our customers through that mobile technology is key. So I think that's going to drive a lot of individual productivity, but the back-end process and data mining productivity as well. Once that data collection point becomes ubiquitous, if you will, back into a central database, a lot more mining of the data or pulling out trends become very, very key. So from a retail side, we're very keen to that. So if you're in your Giant loyalty card or your Shell loyalty card or whatever, all that data mining, while it seems new, really exists. And it's out there and it's commercial. It's just adapting it to the government for productivity indices. And the biggest part the government has to get over is the security issue. So the analogy I use there is this will be the last one. We're working with the defense commissaries. They really don't have a loyalty program because that they thought or perceived there was an issue with security. There is no issue with security. It's voluntary. But the benefit of that and how you can link together, and the scenario that we have is a woman is in the store shopping, her husband is forward deployed in Afghanistan. She can scan her card, up comes customized screensavers. She can immediately check where he is sent through the internet from Afghanistan, I need the following products. It checks what she buys against what he needs. He didn't get what he needs. Do you want it sent? Do you want to send a clerk to get it? By the way, little Betsy has a birthday coming up in 7 days. She likes yellow cake, strawberry icing. You don't have it, right? So the dynamics of understanding the individual, and in this case, customizing the experience to the support of the warfighters becomes very key. It's very simple to bridge that to the IRS, to the VA, or any one of us as an individual who wants to interact with the government, right? About if you want that data there, it can be protected, but it can, I come full circle now, back to your individual experience. And when your customer experience is good, the government is perceived well, money flows, and productivity results. And there are plenty of cases for that.
Great. Thank you, Stan. Alan?
Well, we can end early because I agree with everything the panelists just said. If I had an opportunity to rename this panel, instead of calling it the role of innovation, technology, and driving government productivity, to me is a word missing. It would be the role of leadership in innovation, technology, and driving government productivity. Because we talk about these things as if they have lives of their own. In some cases, they do. So here are some of my comments. When I look at the federal government, we hear terms too big to fail, but I also wonder out loud to myself, at least, is it too big to succeed? In terms of some of the large projects that we've seen that have not really lived up to what it should have done, at least in the first rollout. And there's a lot of, failure stories, but ultimately what we don't hear is that they ultimately do succeed. So unfortunately, the headlines really give a very negative, cast a very negative shadow, and that's why I agree. It's really about, to me, how the public perceives government, because productivity is a weird thing. I mean, I think we could come up with different definitions of what do we mean by productivity. I saw someone at the state capitol get an award for cutting out a program, and they saved a lot of money by eliminating 70 staff people. So, they got an award for cutting 70 staff. They were able to say they would save $1 million over 3 years in this particular state. And I thought, that's good. So that would be a measure of productivity, because there are non-reoccurring costs associated with the staff that let go. They've increased their processes by automating some of the things that were done by staff. Unfortunately, when you look at the budget, after the first year, that savings never reappears. So suddenly, now you've saved X dollars, it looks good for a press release, but then what happens in year 2 and year 3? That money is no longer reinvested in technology. So I guess where I'm coming from ultimately is my vantage point is that of working with cities and counties, to some extent states. And to me, there's a very different picture going on at the local government level that I think is more hopeful. I mean, number one, you have something like 36 units of government, actually 89,000 units of government, depending upon how you count it, but I'm taking maybe 36 as a better target of cities and counties and townships. And I see amazing amounts of innovation and productivity. And I also see so much more work that needs to be done, and hence the word leadership, in terms of, are our city managers really equipped to deal with some of the things? Because I see so many people saying, I don't want to be an early adopter, I want to be last online to deal with technology because I was burned 10 years ago. And it's not just not getting the headlines, they're not pushing forward. And so many of the people who are in charge of technology are lacking champions at the high end. And so they're left on their own, and there's real no incentives for them, in the sense that, why should I save money for the government? I mean, I'll score some points short term, but long term that doesn't really appear ever again. And the money doesn't get reinvested into an aging infrastructure. And I think one of the crises is just this lack of attention to our digital infrastructure. And we've seen it happen over and over again. In fact, 3 years ago, we saw it here in Washington, D.C. We saw it when people woke up. How many people live in Montgomery County? Anybody here? Then you might have, if you drive, realized that your relatively short commute may have multiplied by 3 or 4 times when all the traffic lights were totally unsynchronized and inoperable. And this went on for a couple of days, painful. But this was a 30-year central controller that failed because it looked good. And I've always said the problem with technology is it doesn't show its age. And people against here, you need to learn from that. You need to have equipment that starts to rust. And you need to have software screens that start to fade and no longer show color, to remind people that there's a useful life of these things, and they are ultimately going to fail. It was the same day that all our Metro buses lacked communication with each other, and it happened again. Another 30-year-old controller, different part, different manufacturer. In both cases, they were out of business. They no longer existed. In the case of Montgomery County, they actually had to locate a part by someone who happened to have one in a warehouse somewhere, and fly it down to BWI and have actually a police escort race it to the Montgomery Control Center and install it in the 3.5 day. So, and the public is really quite upset, because they weren't blaming the transportation department, they were blaming the city council, and it became very, very political. So, there are some stories like that where we neglect our infrastructure because it's easy to do. But we also know that there's some really cool things happening. And so here are the trends that I see, at least at the local end. We do have some very active chief innovation officers, and I have to stop and say, what is innovation? Just like I question what is productivity. Innovation, I don't think it's anything about creating anything from scratch. It's not like creating something that was never done before. To me, innovation is coming up with better ways to do something using existing pieces of technology or business process and rethinking things. And so suddenly we see a move afoot in many of our localities to create a position of Chief Innovation Officer. Now that's got some issues too, because where there's a Chief Innovation Officer, as in the city of San Francisco, that also is a Chief Information Officer, Chief Knowledge Officer, and a Chief Technology Officer, in many cases reporting to different people, it's really a nightmare. So this is just a beginning trend. Number 2, we have Chief Data Officers in 12 cities across the country. What I find troubling is that they're doing an amazingly good job of trying to figure out what sets of data should be made public. And their hope is that somebody is going to take this data and make some sense of it, and maybe even develop an app that hadn't been contemplated before. To me, that's incredibly short-sighted. And as been mentioned here, the beauty here is take that data and how do we make better data-driven decisions based on the information? And when I ask these people, is that part of their goal? They go, well, ultimately, yeah, but we're not there yet. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in terms of what these roles are going to actually shake out and do. In the case of Philadelphia, we have a chief innovation officer that is also the chief information officer. And he really did a good job of vying for that. It's kind of like marriage. The best time to get things on the table is before you get even engaged. And he did that. He held out. It's kind of an amazing story. He was living in Trenton, and he was being wooed to go to Philadelphia. To me, that's a no contest. Trenton, Philadelphia. But he played his cards very carefully. He was the chief information officer of the state of New Jersey. So he'd been there for many years. He'd been an employee of the state of New Jersey for 21 years, or thereabouts. And but he said, I will do it only if I become the chief innovation officer. And then he went on to define what that meant. In many cases, the chief information officer has its own issues, where I think so many public managers look upon them as chief infrastructure officers. That I word is very tricky, meaning keeping the networks running, keeping the trains running on time has been described. And I think that's incredibly short-sighted in terms of the potential that exists for these individuals. They really need to step back and reclaim that information piece, because government really live on information. And that's really the most important thing. Data itself is numbers. Information is the next level, and then we get wisdom, and from there we can make better decisions. So when I look around the country, I see things, even in Montgomery County, I come back to them, that had a problem with their transportation system. But if you look at their Open Montgomery website and you look at some of their apps, it's one of the best around. And counties don't always get the recognition. It's always about smart cities. We don't hear about smart counties. But there are many, many smart counties as well. If I look at cities, I look at cities such as Chicago with their smart data, open data in New York. And again, I will come back to Philadelphia in terms of what they're doing with their city stat type programs. I would actually include San Francisco in there as well. Local governments obviously are the front line to dealing with citizens. And they're still experimenting about that ultimate interface that builds trust and productivity, at least having a better experience. They're less concerned, in my opinion, about productivity in terms of saving money than they are about having a better user experience. And I'm amazed at some of the things that have been tried in a way to get people to do more things online. In the state of Virginia, no one loves DMV, but really they've gotten a lot better. But you go to their website and you'll see there's 21 transactions that you can now do online without having to come to DMV. The problem is that if you do show up and you are asked to do one of the things that could be done online, suddenly you're now paying a premium of a tax of 5%. The IRS was charging a convenience fee. So to one extent, we want people to use these things. For paying convenience fees, to me, it runs a counter to what we should be doing. So to sum up, I think local governments are taking the lead, but their scale is less. So I'm being understanding of why that's not necessarily happening at the federal level, but I think we can learn a lot in terms of some of the success stories that have occurred. So my hope is to engage in some conversation here and just leave it at that point. But I will say that it is about leadership and getting people to realize how these tools work and to finance them. And final thought, as we move more of our services because of budget constraints into cloud-based services, there is an interesting shift that will occur. And that is that people will now be forced to move some of the things that they're doing into an operating budget environment as opposed to a capital budget because of the short-term nature of how they're paying for it. So in a sense, I think we'll have less governments that are still working on Windows XP, because it's going to force people to continue to be in an upward track of making sure that whatever system they're using is going to be upgraded for that price.
Great.
All right, well, thank you, everybody. Before we open it up to comments or questions, I just want to ask the panel one question. It's sort of a miracle to me that any productivity exists, any productivity gains exist in government, because on the one hand, you really have a hard time firing people. So if a private sector company streamlines its logistics system and can do it 40% less, they can get rid of people. So you've got labor union problems of downsizing particular functions. Second problem you have is that you don't, in some ways, Marcus, to your point, you don't really get a lot of the benefits from cutting your costs, because you and the budget committee would go and look at that and go, now they have a new baseline, so they're not going to need as much money. Now,
it's worse than that.
Okay.
So if you save discretionary money, you're not saving a thing because it's going to be spent somewhere else. It'll either get swept up by the CFO's office in your agency and reassigned somewhere else in the agency, which is typically what happens, or the appropriators, if the agency saves it, the appropriators will sweep it up and spend it somewhere else.
Yeah.
So because there's a cap on discretionary spending, 98%, more than 98% of money is going to be spent every year. So if you save it, it doesn't actually get saved. I mean, that's something about discretionary spending people don't really get. But
Yeah, and also you get no benefit as an individual. So
you help someone else.
You've helped someone else, and you probably made your life slightly more onerous because you may have to lay some people off, or it may not work, and you get blamed for it. You certainly don't get a bonus. And then lastly, we have all these, chief information officers. Alan, you talked about this, chief all this. I've never seen a chief productivity officer. I don't see the Office of Federal Government Productivity. I mean, OMB in theory should do this, but they don't. And so I guess the question to me would be, are there sort of structural things like that, whether it's in Congress or Tom, and sort of best practices you've seen around the world, where you can align these incentives? Because I think one of the things we're all saying is there's an incredible suite of technologies now that are here, a lot cheaper, a lot easier to use, but we don't have the institutional system to adopt them at the right pace. So I don't know, Tom, do you want to just comment on that?
So I think some of those are the inherent structural challenges of government. And I think it's probably worth noting a little bit on the private sector side where you see productivity gain and where you don't. When you see natural monopolies, you actually don't see productivity gain. Take the U.S. in telecommunications before it was opened up, and certainly mobile started to challenge. So it's not necessarily inherent that the private sector is better than the public sector, but there's something about transparency and pressure that are the keys. In the private sector, it's competition, so there's a lot of competition, you see a lot of productivity gain. And you would say in the U.S., healthcare, which has struggled to have productivity gains, is largely private sector delivered, is a laggard in adoption. We can talk about the U.S., the federal government being a laggard in adoption in technology. I would argue that healthcare may be further behind in terms of how to manage its business, not the adoption of medical technology per se to deliver healthcare, but how to manage the delivery of it. So I think there's no magic answer, panacea, silver bullet, but transparency and pressure. So as Marcus said, some pressure and dialogue around the budget actually can drive innovation, and full transparency around that performance. I think you can have better informed discussions in the appropriations process at an OMB. You see in other governments where they have really, and you see this more at state and local and some other smaller federal governments, where the sort of head of it believes that he or she is sort of the CEO, if you will, and they have more regular performance dialogues, and you can chart some of their impacts. But I think that's kind of where it lies.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Marcus.
So I just wanted to add, this was at one of Alan's major points. There is an opportunity for leadership, a strong leader and champion and champions to make a dent in this area. I mentioned that all discretionary spending all gets spent. That doesn't have to be that way. There is a rescission process. There's a process by which the federal government can let budget authority also expire. And for instance, if you had a president or cabinet officials who made that a priority and said, I'm going to rescind some money because I found productivity gains, that would be, you could make that happen, and there are presidents who have done that.
Yeah.
And I was at a recent meeting of, believe it or not, productivity managers of local government. And there's a group that's forming, and it was interesting to hear their issues. And the number one issue is, how do they measure productivity and do it in such a way that is not threatening to staff? So it was like you could see where their thinking was, because they obviously were not getting enough support from those they reported to. But it's another issue. It's like, who is keeping this? Is it something like we have now with the FAA, where they have a new kind of way of thinking that they want pilots to say what's wrong when something happens, as opposed to worrying about being punished for some of the infractions that occur having to do with safety? In this case, do they collaborate with the operating departments to measure better productivity, or do they just do it external to them and come up with some kind of report card that they have no participation in? So it's a real interesting. There are some real interesting attempts, but part of it is the climate in which it's being done. Who is it that's providing the leadership, and what are the so-called outcomes that can be expected?
So I was going to say on this related point, Marcus, you talked about the sort of the real world of the budgeting, and so how it might affect things in the future. But in a utopian budget world, which is the world I live in, the world of unreality. Wow. We would have budget constraints pressuring agencies to get leaner and more productive, but we'd also have a fund that they can tap into to make that happen sooner. And what we do is we either just give them a bunch of money with no incentive for productivity and they get fat and lazy and happy like any monopolist would do it, or we just constrain them so much they don't even have any money to do these kinds of investments. And I understand if you can maybe talk a little bit about that, because there's some interesting models out there, like it is switching from capital O&M. How do you get agencies to be able to make investments that will save them money over a period of time with a nice ROI, but they don't have to cough up capital that they don't have? Dan, do you want to talk about that, Chris?
Well, I think the key, it starts with the basic value proposition. They're interested in the solution. They like what they see, and you enter into a discussion. What's standing in the way of the measurement metrics, the such. You're now sort of weaving together the desire, contracting rules, and a few other things. But for the most part, they realize the color of money issue. That's pretty much. I look at you, the budgeting, and the color of the money is just huge right now within the organizations. It's just one of those. It's really the art of the deal. It's how do you talk with them, you set it up. I will throw in other intangibles if you want to get through it easy. Find yourself a minority-owned, disadvantaged, veteran-owned leasing company, right? And if you want to go for the trifecta, get yourself a Native American-owned leasing company, because the procurement laws around that are it doesn't really even have to go out for public bid. Right, so they get the benefit of the solution, they get the benefit of not having to go through traditional contracting rules, and they can get the benefit of the savings and an economic model that bypasses a lot of the contracting rules. So it's really having the dialogue, understanding the financial needs and the terms, and finding the right contracting vehicle, because most of us up here, at least I am, I either have to have mentor programs underneath me or slide in underneath somebody for that.
Good.
So that's kind of the secret sauce, but I mean, that's just the way to approach it.
I was talking to a federal agency CIO recently, and he explained to me that one of the deputy CIO just got a visit from a company that said they should do business with this company because they're an Alaskan native-owned corporation. And this guy was not obviously Alaskan himself, but he has a sort of a front company that was set up for this because many, many years ago, a powerful senator from Alaska set up this rule that you could get rid of these onerous procurement restrictions or minimize them if you went this path. And it appears to be kind of, we haven't really touched on procurement much, but there's a lot of problems there. So why don't you just open it up if folks have comments or questions, you want to just jump in? And
Yeah, one question is that in terms of productivity, a lot of the non-service sector sides of the government, policy sides, don't, that's business process improvement, and that's cultural, and that's extremely difficult to change, and that's maybe half the iceberg, saying just heuristically. So how do you go about tackling that? Is that really going to be a force of like, okay, you're getting less money each year that has to improve with that? Or is that finally they adapt to new business processes? Anyone?
Yeah. So I think, and Marcus could probably give it, but if I look at the agencies, it depends upon how you define policy. So if it's the regulatory component for certainly regulators, that's a portion of their business. But I think if you took the whole civilian side of government, it wouldn't be that large, because you have very large agencies like Social Security and IRS, Customs and Border Protection, et cetera, who have very large frontline workforces. And when you add up the hundreds of thousands there, you get to, doing policy at the SEC, which would be one of the larger ones, is probably 500 people, because still most of their people are doing enforcement actions.
Right.
So I think just understanding
more on the
that
DoD side then, where you've seen the growth of that headquarters and stuff.
but even in DoD, that's going to be relative to, say, folks doing logistics or procurement. It's going to be smaller. So I do think it's it's certainly an area where better use of data and transparency can do it. So just in a sort of small P policy regulatory way in DHS, in a couple of the agencies, they've started to log what exactly are we working on, which is seems sort of basic, but what's in the queue, what is needed to make a decision, and can we make it quickly? And so just that transparency can be helpful. We've all heard of the awful scenario where someone's been doing analysis for 6 months. They're supposed to meet with the administrator. It gets canceled 3 times. They work for 3 more months, and then they do it. And the administrator, why are you working on it? I mean, that's so just some transparency can help. But it's also the other part that I think is interesting is where you have citizen interaction on it, or sort of openness. So you've seen it a lot in the White House, particularly where you can have open comment, and we don't have to have the series of roundtables around the country, and we take months and months and months to gather input. It's open for 30 days or 60 days, and we can kind of do it all at once. You can feed on others' trends or sort of online to what others say. Those are just some of the ways to drive a faster process and better decision making, which is at the root of policy.
Yeah, there's so much low-hanging fruit here. I'm trained as an industrial engineer, and so I'm an EPA, and so where's the flow chart for how you make a regulation here? No one had ever put one together. And just doing that and realizing all the places where there was a serial flow and making a bunch of them parallel. And the thing is, everybody in the agency was frustrated by how long it takes to do these things, and so there was a common incentive to, without affecting, personnel, for instance, to save time, which ends up saving costs as well. There's just so much low-hanging fruit. There's plenty to do without threatening people.
So historically, what I found is doing policy is one thing. That's more judgmental. If you're talking about process, right, to get to where you want to go, the people that own the process side historically, and to go to a point that Alan made, are concerned with, I have X number of people, I can't go to some number less than X. That's not in the DNA, especially the federal government, to do a reduction in force unless it occurs over a natural attrition period of retirement and everything else. So for productivity, because it can be a vague indice, there is no shortage of volume of work, right? In fact, more than enough volume exists to fit into a productivity equation to show that you're doing more with less, right? I mean, it's really, to your point, it's very low-hanging fruit. There's more than enough out there. There's more than enough out there that hasn't even been touched. So now you get into, I can categorize the volume, I can improve an interaction, right? One of the things that we've done and been successful at when we went for the low-hanging fruit, we went to what we call the congressional inquiries. And we did some deep mining on this about 3 years ago and found out there was a whole spectrum of where you were getting continual dissatisfactions coming from congressmen of areas serving their constituents. We went right to those, put a plan in place, and it showed the elimination of the congressionals by improving, the citizen experience, and all of a sudden the money showed up and people became very productive, right? So it really was a win-win. You eliminated a pain point, you improved quality of service. You captured data that showed that you were doing more with less and protected the jobs. Now, long term on the process, where did the rub come in? The rub was not coming in at the worker level, and it wasn't coming in at the executive level. The rub was coming in the process at the mid-management level, because that's where the optimization occurs over time. When you reach, relatively stable volumes, that in the government is where you come into efficiency savings. If you want to get down to pure productivity, that is where you saw the resistance. So when you create your strategy and you go into that, you have to take a look at the mid-level managers, and it doesn't hurt to be creative working within the agency about how do you reuse that population, because if you can do that within the context of a multi-year plan, there is enough natural attrition and movement of people, right, that it can work out. But most of the agencies that are population heavy don't think through manpower and workforce planning I'm kind of again to the attrition, right? Once you can help them think through that, and that's sort of the data mining against that, then there's very clear paths where it becomes a win-win-win across the board for everybody. So that's, you're putting a lot of sales effort into that, but you build a relationship with that.
So Alan, a quick comment, because then I want everybody to, I'm going to just prepare everybody here. I want everybody to, as we close, to think of, if you could advise the head of OMB or whoever, one thing you would suggest that the government does, which we'll get to in a second. So Alan.
Oh, this will be a very quick asterisk. I think what we're saying here is that we have a soft side of this whole issue of productivity, and we have the harder side in terms of real numbers. The one word we have not used, and I just wanted to make sure we understand, is you have to have benchmarking somewhere along the line. We have to have a way to figure out what does it cost to send out a letter, what does it cost, and try to figure out how you do this, even if there's different ways to arrive at that, because otherwise people are just reporting their own data, and then we're making decisions in a zero-sum game, and you might find, one agency, it costs 20 times more to do the same function as somewhere else. And until we get to that point, getting back to this point of benchmarking, we're missing something, because numbers then can tell whatever story the manager wants to tell. And I think we're seeing that in local government a little bit, where they're starting to figure out what's acceptable in terms of collection of certain things, whether it be information or garbage. So to me, benchmarking is a very, very important piece to all this.
Okay, so just to close, because I want to keep us on time. Everybody just say sort of one thing. Here's mine one thing, which actually the Obama administration is in the attempting to do, which is to make it a complete and total ban on any kind of PDF or other forms that are not you're not able to input the data in an electronic form on the internet. In other words, the idea that you would be printing out forms and writing them and then sending them in, and then someone else would scan them, or that's sort of a simple low-hanging fruit. Believe it or not, many federal agencies still do not have web-enabled PDFs, even though they're certainly they're there. You can buy and you can get them. Daniel?
Yeah, I go back to the DMV example. I just think, every time there's an online version versus the paper version, the online version should be either cheaper, or there should be some kind of fee attached to the other one, because we need to align the incentives and the cost structure to get the adoption.
Great.
So at the end of the day, it takes people to do all of this, and I would invest, in addition to the leadership, in data analytics to unlock the performance.
So every agency has a set of Government Performance and Results Act measures, which by law they're required to report on every year. I would require at a rate of 10% a year that those be converted into unit cost measures, so that there's the measure of what we're getting per dollar spent.
I'm kind of build off if those occur. One of the big things I see is the lack of some glue that says I have the ability to put in a solution with a partial return, but if I could have, I'm not trying to look to create an entity, but if I could get more cooperation among agencies to use multi-purpose devices, the economies and the economic points change substantially. So, as an example, we have 3 different agencies that are using multi-purpose kiosks. I'm happy to have the sale, but all 3 of them have the kiosk in the exact same location, and it's all menu driven. but there is no way inside the government for the three of them to come together and share the infrastructure and the cost base. It's just ridiculous, because once it occurs, it fights. There's nobody charged with the right set of metrics that says, this is ridiculous, guys. Three of you can use the exact same thing.
Alan?
Now I'm wearing my academic hat. I think we need more training and development programs for senior managers at all levels of government to really make innovation and productivity and change, not just buzzwords, but real case studies to better prepare people. The new group coming into government, which will be many, in our public affairs, public administration programs and elsewhere. They just need to have a better appreciation. These are not buzzwords. There are real tools out there that can make this happen.
Great, well, thank you. And thank you to all the speakers. We've talked a little bit about the role of data in this, particularly Tom's comments. If you're interested more in this, I encourage you to look at our new Center for Data Innovation, datainnovation.org, and also perhaps to attend our second annual Data Innovation Day, which is January 23rd. We'll be up here at the Reserve Officers facility up on Capitol Hill, where we're going to bring some of the leading data innovators in the private sector and the public sector together. So thank you all for attending, and please join me in thanking a wonderful panel.